welcome to Local Heroes from the Browns Hill Dolmen. This tomb, with its 150-ton capstone, was put up 6,000 years ago by some very ingenious people, like my heroes this week, who all come from Ireland. I've come here to celebrate a man who is not only a mountaineer, but also a brilliant experimental scientist who worked on practically everything from magnetic crystals to foghorns. And in particular, he worked out why the sky is blue. Well, sometimes anyway. He was born right here in Lochlan Bridge, and his name was John Tyndall. John Tyndall was born into a small landowning family. They were poor, but John studied hard, became a draftsman, got a PhD, and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. He became an avid mountaineer, publishing a book on the subject, and was the first man to climb the 14,780-foot Weisshorn in Switzerland. In 1868, he was experimenting with a beam of light and finding out what happened when he passed it through what he called optically pure air, that is, air out of which he'd carefully filtered all the particles. And he was amazed to find he couldn't see the beam. Then he realized that the fact that he could normally see the beam meant that a lot of the light was being scattered by all the bits of dust and smoke that were in it. And you can see this beam easily. It's coming from this projector because the whole of this atmosphere is full of dust and smoke particles. He wondered what caused the scattering and whether the size of the particles mattered. So he took a tank of water like this one and he put in some particles, and I'm putting in just a pinch of milk powder. And I'm going to stir this up. You see it's in quite big lumps, but when I stir it up it'll dissolve and form very, very fine particles of milk. And what you can see then is that you can now very clearly see the beam going through this tank, where it is, and also see the fact that it's blue. He realized this, and he realized the significance of this, and he made one of those great leaps of the imagination. He realized that that is why the sky is blue. The light from the sun is streaming down at us, and some of that light gets scattered by the tiny particles of dust in the atmosphere. And so when you look up at the sky, what you're seeing, the bright blue sky, is actually sunlight scattered off little particles of dust. The particular particles in the atmosphere scatter more light at the blue end of the spectrum, which is why the sky looks blue rather than any other colour. When kids draw pictures of the sun, they always colour the sun yellow, and that's quite right because it's originally white, but when some of that blue light is scattered away, it's left with a yellow light because white minus blue is yellow. And then he realised what must be happening in the evening. When the sun is very low down, its light comes to us through a whole lot of atmosphere. And so let me just add a bit more atmosphere to my tank here. And when all the blue light is scattered out of the sunlight, what you then get is a red sunset. And that was how John Tyndall realised why you get red sunsets and why the sky is blue. In 1867, when the great Michael Faraday died, Tyndall took over as the superintendent of the Royal Institution. He also inherited Faraday's knack of making science popular. John Tyndall was not only a brilliant experimental scientist, but also a brilliant demonstrator. He spent a lot of his life giving public lectures, trying to get across the ideas of physics. And for example, when he wanted to talk about total internal reflection, an optical phenomenon that might possibly not be grabbing to the man on the Clapham omnibus, he invented the light pipe, which was a really beautiful demonstration. Here I've got a bucket of water, and at the back here I've got a torch which I can turn on like that, and then I shine that through this window at the back of the bucket, and it comes out at the front, and so when I pull out the bung, water will come out. Now, that's not very exciting, and you would expect that the light would go onto the end of my finger from the torch at the back. But what is surprising is that the light goes all the way down the water stream. Just look at this. It lights up my hand there, and all the way down like that. So the light is actually trapped inside the stream of water by total internal reflection. And in that way, Tyndall brought these ideas alive and really enthused people, gave them something to talk about in the pub. And this, in fact, is exactly the way that fibre optics work. And curiously enough, Tyndall himself predicted that light pipes would one day be used for telephony. An amazing vision, given that telephones working with copper wire had only just been invented. This small town is right in the middle of Ireland. In fact, so much so it has been called the Navel of Ireland. The official name of the town is Birr, but the association with the Parsons family has been so strong that for many years, even on the maps, it was called Parsonstown. During the 1840s, the biggest astronomical telescope the world had ever seen was built right here in Parsonstown by William Parsons. William Parsons, later the Earl of Ross, was born in York. Fortunately, he married a fantastically wealthy woman, Mary Wilmer Field, and so had plenty of cash for science in the family home, Birr Castle. Sir William Herschel, who had discovered the planet Uranus, died in 1822, and Parsons decided to carry on where Herschel had left off. His ambition was to build the world's largest telescope in the grounds of Birr Castle, and it's still there. And this is it. This is the telescope tube, made of wood like a barrel. It's 58 feet long and nearly 7 feet in diameter. Look, I can stretch my hands right out. It was opened officially by Dean Peacock of the Church of Ireland, who walked through it wearing a top hat with a raised umbrella. And they called it the Leviathan of Parsonstown. He decided to make the telescope entirely on the estate. The most taxing job was casting a disc of speculum metal, a highly reflective mix of copper and tin. To melt the speculum metal for his mirrors, he needed to build a foundry. And when he wasn't making mirrors, his wife Mary borrowed the foundry to build these amazing cast-iron gates for the castle. The casting was successful, but after a month of grinding, the mirror broke. The second time, he produced a brilliant mirror, 6 feet in diameter and weighing 4 tons. Although magnification is useful, more important is a big telescope's ability to gather light from very faint objects, and its resolution, which lets you separate stars that appear close together. This huge structure was mounted between two massive walls, 70 feet long and 50 feet high. To look through the telescope, you had to be at the top of the tube, and Ross built a series of moving galleries to take the observer to where the eyepiece was. He wanted to find out about curious things called nebulae, which in small telescopes look like faint blurs. The great telescope made Ross the first person ever to see their incredible structure. While he was observing, he made pencil sketches, and then later in the light he worked them up with chalk on black paper, and here is one of his original sketches, perhaps the most famous one of all. This is M51, and he writes here, "This is the first nebula in which a spiral arrangement was detected. The discovery was made in April 1845. Isn't that wonderful? His own handwriting, his own sketch, and you can see the spiral absolutely clearly, and also the spiral form of this second nucleus over here. And this is the Owl Nebula, and he was the first person ever to see the two stars in the eyes of the owl. It's in the middle of Ursa Major, the Great Bear. And here is his notebook for 1863. You see the 12th of January, Jupiter observed, definition V bad. And then further down the page, Saturn, and there's a lot of stuff about Saturn and a picture. Presumably these are the moons that he could see. And down here, Uranus. So there's all the different things he saw that night. And then you turn over and see what happens the next day. And it's obviously very sort of blotted and difficult in writing in the dark. And here we are, Uranus, and a lot of stuff about that, Saturn, and another little picture showing how the moons have moved during the course of the night. All the details he saw day after day after day. For 75 years, this fantastic machine, the Leviathan of Parsonstown, was the biggest telescope in the world, and famous astronomers came here from far and wide just to see it and also to use it if they could. Unfortunately, the Irish weather isn't always terribly kind to astronomers, so very often they had to stand around in the rain and had nothing to look at but clouds. What's more, the damp meant that the mirror tarnished very quickly and had to be polished all the time. The resolving power of this instrument was absolutely unparalleled. The Earl of Rosse died in 1867, and 100 years later, Sir Bernard Lovell wrote, "It is to the everlasting credit of Lord Rosse that he discovered the spiral structure of the nebulae." In the history of science, just occasionally, scientific instruments have changed the way we think about the world. For example, Galileo's telescope not only overthrew all current views of astronomy, but revolutionized the way we think about the universe. My next hero was born right here at Lismore Castle in County Waterford, early in 1627. And the instrument he used was a bit like this, an air pump. Surprisingly, with this really modest bit of equipment, he helped to lay the foundations for modern science. He was the 7th son of the great Earl of Cork, and his name was Robert Boyle. From Ireland, young Robert was packed off to Eton at the tender age of 4, and then at 11 he was sent to study in Europe. While in Venice, he heard of Galileo's death and began to study his writings. When he came back from the continent, he was seriously interested in science, particularly chemistry. But unfortunately, his dad had died, and he had to come over to Ireland to sort out the estate. He found it a fairly miserable place. "A barbarous country," he wrote, "where chemical spirits are so misunderstood and chemical instruments so unprocurable that it was hard to have any scientific thoughts there." Well, he may have been scathing, but I think this is the perfect place to try out some of Boyle's scientific thoughts. Galileo and others had begun to cast off the influence of ancient Greek scientists. Suddenly, new ideas were possible. Boyle had heard about an air pump. It had been made in Germany, and he thought it might lead to some interesting experiments. So he engaged an assistant, a chap called Robert Hooke, to make him one, and it was a bit like this. And it consists here of a tube with a piston, a plunger that fits very tightly in it, and he called the thing inside the sucker. And this has an arrangement of valves so that every time I pull up, it pulls a little bit of air out of there, and that pulls the air out of here, and that pulls the air out of the bell jar sitting on this glass plate, on this metal plate. And inside the bell jar, it starts with air, and as he pulls, each stroke, it pulls a little bit of the air out, and so you gradually create a partial vacuum inside the bell jar. Now, one of the first experiments he did was to put inside the bell jar a partially inflated lamb's bladder. And I've actually used a balloon because they had more of those in the shop in Lismore when I went to look this morning. And then he started to pull the air out like this. Now, this seems a pretty trivial sort of experiment 340 years later, but actually it caused tremendous controversy. People said, "Oh, you can't possibly do things by experiments. The right way is, as Aristotle said, observe nature and then make logical deductions. And that's the way you discover new things." And other people said, "You're not actually pumping any air out. All you're doing is stirring around the air inside and causing things to flutter, and you think there's something happening and it isn't at all." Boyle said, "I don't care about all this argument and logical deduction. I want to make experiments and observe nature in action." Wow, it gets harder and harder work. And it takes a long time with a little pump like this, but eventually the lamb's bladder or balloon actually inflates. And what's happening is not that there's more air getting into the lamb's bladder, but I'm sucking the air out of the bell jar here. The pressure in there is going down, and so the little bit of air that was inside the balloon is forcing it to blow up. Boyle did a lot of experiments like this, and he found there was an exact relationship. When the pressure was halved, the volume doubled. And in fact, it was very general. Whenever the pressure got higher, the volume got smaller, and whenever the volume got higher, the pressure got smaller. He said it was a law of nature, and it came to be called Boyle's law. And another of the experiments that Boyle tried was burning a candle in his bell jars. And it's burning there with a nice clear flame. Put the bell jar on, and it's still quite happily burning, but watch what happens when I pump the air out. All that pumping was rather hard work, so I've now got an electric pump hooked up to my bell jar. The flame's getting smaller. It's going blue. And gradually it looks sicker and sicker. And eventually it dies altogether. And Boyle concluded there was something in the air that allowed the candle to burn. Boyle was also interested in sound, and he wanted to find out whether he needed air to hear sound. So he put a bell in his bell jar, I'm using an alarm clock, and then he pumped the air out of it. The sound gets fainter and fainter, and eventually you can't hear the bell at all. And therefore he proved that you really need air to carry sound from the bell to your ears. Robert Boyle was tall and fair, but he was always pale and sickly. He hated oaths, and he wouldn't take an oath, and as a result of that, he had to refuse to be President of the Royal Society, and refuse to be Provost of Eton, and refuse a peerage. His writing was very convoluted and rather difficult to read. But in spite of that, he's a real hero of mine, not only because of Boyle's law, but also because he championed the idea of inventing experiments in order to study nature. After his death, he was very neatly summed up. Robert Boyle was the son of the Earl of Cork and the father of modern chemistry. This is Shannon Airport in the west of Ireland. I've come here to celebrate a man whose invention played a vital, pioneering role in the history of aviation. He was a chef, and his name was Joe Sheridan. Joe Sheridan was born in County Tyrone in 1909. Round about 1942, he got a job at the seaport of Foynes. At that time, transatlantic passenger flights were all made by flying boat. You could land in the water if the weather or fuel consumption got the better of you. They left from Botwood, Newfoundland on the far side, and from Foynes. Now, Joe was working as a chef at Foynes, which is where the flying boats used to come in, just across the Shannon estuary. And the passengers used to arrive cold, wet, miserable. The catering manager, Brendan O'Regan, said, look, we've got to come up with something that'll warm them up, cheer them up, improve their mood. Joe, you invent something. And so Joe did. And what he invented was this: Irish coffee, which is, of course, a very scientific beverage.
Now, one perfect Irish coffee.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Slanta. Oh, isn't it delicious? It tastes wonderful too. Hot alcoholic coffee drunk through the cold cream. Really delicious combination. Now, let's see if I can make one myself. So I need a glass, and I need some sugar, a spoonful and a half, or maybe 2 spoons of brown sugar. And the sugar is very important because not only does it make it taste sweet, but it increases the density of the lower layer. Okay, whiskey now, supposed to be 1 measure, 1/4 of a gill I use over here. I'm just going to cover that sugar in the bottom comfortably. And then the coffee to mix with those two to about 3/4 of an inch from the top. About like that. Now, to get here today, I had to come through the city of Limerick, and I thought perhaps you'd like to have a little reminder in verse about how to make it. Joe Sheridan's cunning hot drink is easy to make if you think that sugar's propensity to increase the density will ensure that the cream doesn't sink. And now we have to float on the cream. And some people advocate pouring it over the back of a spoon, but this seems to work perfectly well. Just take a soup spoon and lower it on very gently like that, so it sits on top. But could I use Joe's great idea the other way round? In other words, use sugar to make the cream denser than the coffee. Now, after the war, they stopped using flying boats, but the conventional planes still came to Shannon to refuel, and Irish coffee remained a great hit. In the 50s, a travel writer from the San Francisco Chronicle called Stanford Delaplane came over here, and he liked the Irish coffee so much that he imported the idea to the States. And a few years later, they actually drank more Irish coffee in San Francisco than in the whole of Ireland. Okay, let's see if I can get this cream down to the bottom of that coffee. In due course, they invited Joe Sheridan to go over to San Francisco and make Irish coffee there. Unfortunately, he died there in 1962, but he's buried within sight of the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, look at that. All the cream's at the bottom and all the coffee's at the top. And if I can whip the syringe out, oh, I mixed a bit in. But there you are, upside down Irish coffee. Perhaps you could call it Australian coffee. And with this, I'd like to drink the health of Joe Sheridan. Well, it's all right, but it's not quite as good as his recipe. If you'd like to make Irish coffee, or indeed your own blue sky, send off for the Local Heroes Pack. There are recipes for both. Details at the end of the programme. This is O'Connell Bridge over the River Liffey. My next hero was an anatomist, an economist, a cartographer and a naval architect. And in 1662, he not only became a founding member of the Royal Society, he also built right here in Dublin the fastest boat in the world. His name was William Petty. William Petty was born in Romsey in Hampshire. His father was a clothier, and at an early age, William went to sea. He was such a precocious child, brat might be a better word, that his fellow seamen left him deserted on a French beach. On the 14th of May, 1650, there was an amazing incident. A woman called Anne Green had been convicted of murder and was hanged for half an hour. Then she was cut down and pronounced dead by the sheriff. And he, Petty, got the body because he was an anatomist and needed some practice. And he laid her out on the slab, and then he thought, hang on a sec, she's not dead. And he managed to revive her by a rather amazing combination of medical techniques. He used bleeding, warming with a buxom woman, I'm not quite sure what that means, and digestion of powdered Egyptian mummy. And sure enough, she came back to life. She was pardoned and lived happily ever after. And he became Professor of Anatomy at Brasenose College, Oxford. He first came to Ireland as Physician General to Cromwell's troops, but he soon got himself the job of making a survey of the whole country. He did it absolutely brilliantly. He made a few simple instruments and gave them to unemployed soldiers who went round and made, in the end, a brilliant map. As a result, he came in £9,000 under budget. He got knighted. He moved to Dublin. He lived on St Stephen's Green, somewhere just here, probably roughly where the Shelbourne Hotel is now. While he was here, he became one of the founding members of what turned into the Royal Society, and he got the obsession for building a better sort of boat. Before Petty, boat design had been a matter of tradition, passed from each boat builder to his son. Petty asked two revolutionary questions. First, could you apply science to boat design? And second, could you test your ideas in small? Petty tackled the problem of boat design scientifically, and he realised the most important thing was the shape of the hull. So he thought he'd test a lot of different hulls and see which ones went more easily through the water. Now, there's a great gale blowing outside, and I can't do it in the sea, which is what I wanted to do, so I've had to come into my indoor testing tank. And I've got here two boats with hulls of very different shapes, basically a wide one and a narrow one. And they're going to be towed by these very fine nylon fishing lines in their bows. And the fishing lines run over these pulleys, up towards the ceiling, over a pulley up there, and then down to these weights here. These are half-ounce weights, which are going to pull them forward. So I'll pull the boats back with a finger on each transom, and they've got exactly the same weight pulling each boat, and they're exactly the same length. The only difference is the width of the boat. 1, 2, 3, go. And I would say that's fairly clear that the narrow boat goes faster than the broad boat. So let's just check it again to make sure. By almost a length in the length of the bath, the narrow boat wins the race. Then he tried not just a narrow boat, but an ultra-narrow boat, which is really just a tube. And he thought he would see how that fared. And here we are, same bath, same weights. Let them go at the same moment. 1, 2, 3, go. And you can see that the ultra narrow beats the narrow by maybe 6 inches. It's not quite as much as the difference between the wide and the narrow, but quite significant. Try once more. 1, 2, 3, go. Ba-doing! Yeah, maybe 4 inches. So the narrower the hull, the faster it goes. But the trouble is, of course, that if your hull was as narrow as this, it would have to be enormously long to fit in any number of people or cargo or anything like this. And what's more, if you put a mast in, the whole thing would just fall over. It would be hopelessly unstable. So Petty built himself a model catamaran, 2 ultra-thin hulls with a deck between them, and he raced that against his narrowboat. Okay, back of the bath. 1, 2, 3, go. Wow, look at that. The catamaran is much faster than the narrowboat. Very impressive. 1, 2, 3, go. So there's absolutely no doubt that in small, as he put it, the catamaran is much quicker than the ordinary narrowboat. The question is, would it work at full size? In 1662, he built a 20-foot catamaran, which he called Invention. But he launched her on the 28th of October, the feast of St. Simon and St. Jude, and all the locals called her the Simon and Jude. On the 6th of January, he raced her right here in Dublin Bay against a whole lot of other boats. They started in the harbour, they went round the buoy at the end where the Red Lighthouse now is, and back again. On the outward leg, even though the tide was coming in, he managed an incredible 16 knots and beat them all into the ground. On the way back, he broke his rudder, but it didn't matter. He easily won the race, and he won the Royal Society's silk flag, the Premium Regalis Societatis Velociorum. And you would have thought the catamaran was on the course for success. The catamaran seems like a brilliant idea. The thin hull sliced through the water faster than those of a conventional boat, yet it's wide enough to be more stable. We now know that the Hawaiians and Polynesians had huge double-hulled boats, but no record of this appears in any 17th century writings. For Petty and the Western world, this really was a first. Unfortunately, Petty's dream never really did come true, and catamarans remained a sideline, a backwater, if you like, of the whole sailing industry. They're a lot of fun, and they have been used for racing a great deal, but never for big commercial ventures. Although at last, in the last few years, there are some huge great catamarans sailing about, including the ones carrying passengers into and out of Dublin Bay. I'm sorry, that's all the heroes from Ireland. See you next time! You can do some experiments from this series and the last one with our local heroes kit. We don't make a profit, so it's only £9.95. You can order by credit card by phoning 0990 100 789 anytime, or write to Local Heroes Kit, PO Box 7, London W12 8UD, making your cheque payable to BBC Education. And why not visit the Local Heroes website?
One of Staffage's local heroes revealed on Monday at 8 is Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of you-know-who.